Good morning, everybody. It's 9:30, a sunny morning, so with a bit of luck, you'll be able to enjoy part of the day at least. So welcome and thanks for your attendance as usual, and to officers as well. We don't have any speakers this morning, and we don't have any members of the public in the gallery. So you're very welcome, otherwise it'd be very lonely sitting up here. Just to remind you, which I have to do, is that all attendees to use the microphones, please, when speaking. Please remember to turn on the microphone when you are speaking, ensuring that you speak into the microphone itself or in the direction of the microphone. And once you have finished speaking, please turn it off. Correct usage of the system will allow for an enjoyable sound experience for all. And you will find a laminated copy of the detailed instructions on each row. So I hope we've probably got that word for word now, haven't we? So moving on. Right. Moving on, I just want to point out that we're having a few problems with technology. So I've been asked to sort of delay any further comments.
We can go on and do declarations.
Well, I think I will wait, actually, Vice Chair, if you don't mind, because it is all recorded and we can then ensure that we go through the right stages. So I'll be looking at the two items, particularly item one, which will be the first item, while you've got a minute or two.
Takes to change a light bulb.
Right, thank you for your patience there. Technology problems over, dare I say it. First of all, item 3, which is declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest? No. Confirmation of minutes. The last meeting was on the 15th of May. Can we have somebody who proposes? Thank you, Councillor Evans, Councillor Settle. Seconding. All those in favour, please show. Thank you. Councillor Dixon as well. Thank you. Unanimous. Substitute members. We don't have any substitute members today. So again, thank you for those that are attending. And so we move on to the items of planning matters. And on page 3, you will see item 1 and item 2 outlined there. We're going to look at item 1 on page 4 of the report first. And this is the erection of 3 commercial buildings consisting of 8 units under use class E, and I won't go through all those, and use class B8, including new vehicle access arrangement from Brunel Way, associated car parking and landscaping arrangements. Now, as I say, we don't have any speakers, so I'll ask the officers to do a presentation and then we'll have questions in the debate. So,
thank you, Chair. Good morning, everybody.
Rob, thank you.
So, yeah, as the Chair has just described, we have an application in front of us for 3 commercial buildings providing 8 light industrial and storage and distribution units. The application site is as per the red edge in the right-hand image. Let me just put my channel over here. It forms part of an employment land allocation in the local plan, as you can see in the bottom right-hand image, and that's known as Blackpool and Fyle Industrial Park in Whitehills. For information purposes, there's this orange allocation immediately to the south, This is a mixed use allocation, and we're presently, as officers, considering an outline housing scheme on that site for 266 dwellings. The application that we're considering is phase 1 of 2 phases of development. So the second phase will infill the remaining part of the employment allocation just there. So just a couple of photos for you. As you can imagine, the site hasn't got any buildings on there at the moment. It's vacant and overgrown. There are mature trees and hedgerows to its periphery, as you can see in this bottom left-hand corner. This is a shot taken up Jenny Lane, so you can see obviously the mature trees which form that soft boundary along Jenny Lane. There is a pylon line that runs through the site. You can see a large scale pylon there, and in this bottom right hand image. And a further constraint is we have a pumping station, but we also have underground infrastructure, which includes a foul and surface water main that runs along this western boundary along here. A couple of site photos from within the site. The site has been subject in the past to an element of clearance, and there's been some tipping on that site. The applicant has developed a number of other sites within White Hills, the more recent ones that you can perhaps see on Lytham St Anne's Way. So some of the spoil that has been left over from those sites has been tipped onto this site. There are some gaps within the hedgerow. This bottom left-hand image is along this boundary here, and importantly, there's a gap in this southern boundary, approximately in that location, which opens up views into the back and side garden of a pair of semi-detached dwellings which lie to the south of the application site. Just a couple of photos just to pick up on the surrounding character of the area. It's predominantly commercial. We have industrial buildings to the west and to the northwest. There's an office building which we can see here, which is to the north. To the south, though, we have Old Houses Lane, which splits the application site from the mixed-use allocation that I mentioned previously. There is a house in this location here, a pair of semi-detached dwellings. They don't face towards the application site. Their orientation is on that axis, which looks over this pumping station in the southwest corner of the application site. There is another pair of semi-detached properties to the east of the application site. I could consider that in a little bit more detail when we look at residential amenity in the presentation later on. So the proposed layout, as I said before, because of the infrastructure that's on the site, so the pylons and the surface and foul water drainage, there are quite a lot of constraints on this site. From a pylon perspective, you can't obviously build beneath the pylons, but there's an easement either side of that pylon line which you cannot build buildings or structures underneath. Again, the easement to the west for the drainage that's on site, they have easements as well which buildings cannot develop over. You can see from the layout though that car parking areas, roads, and though that nature of infrastructure can be built within those easements. To add to that, there's another easement which the applicant has included within the scheme, which is a 10-metre landscape buffer to the south. That obviously is there in purpose to protect the existing residents, but also to help develop, and so as not to stymie the redevelopment of the mixed-use allocation which lies to the south as well. The buildings have been orientated so that their gables, which if you can picture is the higher element of the scheme, are facing east and west, so that acts to have the lower eaves level exposed to the south, so the buildings won't appear as obvious when viewed from the residential areas. The access is from Brunel Way, and that is actually from as well Progress Way, which is a continuation of Squiresgate Lane. And then you have Progress Way that links to the bottom of the M55 junction. So access in and out of the site avoids all the main residential areas. We've got 61 parking areas split between 3 separate parking areas. The main car parking areas are in front of buildings 1 and 2, and it's assumed that surplus provision for buildings 2 and 3 will obviously take advantage of the additional spaces outside building 1. The scheme also incorporates a new footpath to the west along Jenny Lane. So if I just flick back to these first photos, you can see in this image to the left, there's no footpath that runs along here. There is a footpath to the south, so obviously from a pedestrian friendly perspective, sustainable transport measures, it's good to incorporate that footpath into the scheme. As per usual, we've got bin and cycle stores in there, and again from an amenity perspective, there's a 1.8 metre acoustic fence that runs along this southern boundary. It doesn't actually run and form that southern boundary, it's set in from that boundary behind the existing and retained landscape features, but also new landscaping that's proposed in that area as well. Building elevations wise, they are not large scale, they're more small scale in nature, 9 metre eaves. Standard construction. I mentioned earlier that the applicant has developed a number of other units within Whitehills. It's envisaged that those schemes that have been built out will influence the design and appearance of buildings on this site, and that's just a snapshot from Google Streets of one of those buildings that has been built out. So, main issues. The site's allocated for employment purposes. We're considering an employment use, including job creation, both from end use of prospective occupants, but during construction as well. So because of the policy allocation and the land use proposed, considering that the principle is acceptable. From a design and layout perspective, obviously we have policy GD7, which I think we're all familiar with now, which requires high standards of design. We have an existing character which is formed predominantly from industrial buildings. They're set back behind car parking and landscaping areas. Materials which are industrially informed, so we've got light grey cladding, we've got mixes of red and buff brick which the proposal incorporates. We have retention of mature trees and landscaping, but we also have new planting which will act to infill the gaps and plug gaps between that existing and retained landscaping features. So from a scale, design and appearance perspective, it's decided that the application design is in keeping with neighbouring uses and is certainly an improvement to the street scene. The other main issue really for consideration is residential amenity. As I said before, there are a couple of houses which neighbour the site. So those that are indicated in green here and here, they are existing neighbours. That arrow indicates the frontage and the direction of where that frontage is facing towards. So in this circumstance, you can see that the frontage is facing over this pumping station area and into this southwestern corner of the application site. And this property over here you can see is a southerly front facing aspect and a side-on relationship to phase 2 and obviously to phase 1. The new houses that are being proposed, the application that we're considering is an outline application, and the layout of houses that's been included within that is for indicative purposes only. Notwithstanding that though, the layout that's been proposed to us at this current time shows houses facing away from the application site, again with a side-on relationship. The separation of those dwellings is over 20 metres, and bearing in mind that landscape buffer to the southern boundary, the acoustic fence line, our environment protection team haven't raised any objections to the scheme. We don't know what the end user is at this moment in time though. The nature of an EG land use, that's described within the land use legislation as being a land use that could quite easily take place within a residential area. Similarly, storage and distribution, the actual use itself won't be a noise-inducing use. Notwithstanding that, though, because we don't know who the end users are, it's very hard to say at this time whether they require 24-hour operation. Obviously, if it is 24-hour operation, that could induce noise disturbance for adjoining residents. So we've imposed an hours of use restriction on the development. And again, we're requiring the acoustic fence to be provided before any occupation of the development as well. So on that basis, there's no other technical issues, Chair, and the application is recommended for approval.
Thank you, Rob. We ask for questions now, please, members. Councillor Evans, thank you. Councillor.
Good morning, Chair. Thank you very much. Thanks, Rob. Very refreshing for the first application of the day because, you know, it seems to be very straightforward, this one. As you pointed out, we're not sure what the end user is, but there's some significant safeguards in place there in terms of distance, orientation, acoustic barriers, and obviously putting a time limit on the operation. Seems to be that with the absence of an end user, that all the safeguards, or as many safeguards as possible, have already been put in place. And it is quite, although there are a couple of semis there and a couple of properties existing, the new houses that are penciled in for potential development next door are not there. So people will have the opportunity to decide whether they wish to purchase a house next to an industrial development rather than the other way around. So on that basis, I don't see, you know, the footpath helps, the parking, 61 spaces seems to be more than adequate. There's no objections in place there. So, you know, colleagues will wish to discuss it further, but I'm quite happy to support this application. I can't see any reason why we shouldn't do. So I'm happy to move that. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I was just wondering precisely where is the pumping station, and I know it'll be outside, but I'm just not quite sure as to whether that has any real significance at all. But it's obvious. It's obviously one of the issues that might come up again if this is going to be a residential area.
Apologies, yeah, I should have made it clear that the pumping station is in this location here.
Yeah.
So it's outside of the application site and isn't being proposed as part of this development. It's helpful though because this space is open, so it provides a bit of a buffer, a relief to the development itself. And like I say, the separation between this property and this building is over 20 metres. So when you consider the separation from the frontage of this property to the back end of this building, you're talking 40, maybe 50 metres as a minimum. So there is substantial distance and it's over land that's outside of the control of the applicant. It's within United Utilities control. So the likelihood is that that land will always remain open and free from built form.
That's what I was interested in. Is this area going to be free of development in the future? It's an open space, is it?
Yeah, I can't guarantee it's going to be open, but because of the use of that as a pumping station by United Utilities, it's highly likely that it will remain open. Notwithstanding that, though, any development would likely require planning permission. So at that time, if that site does come forward for development, we can make a decision in terms of how it would impinge upon neighbours at that time.
And will there be hedging, new hedging along that boundary, the
This one,
horizontal and the
That
vertical round? Yeah.
yeah. If I take you just to the photos quickly, probably this one. So this boundary here that we can see, where you can see the intermittent kind of hedgerow, that is that boundary there with the pumping station. So that the proposal is to infill gaps along that boundary. This boundary to the south is predominantly hedgerow. There are a few gaps in there, so you can see there's that gap there, which is that gap in that area. Again, it's proposed to plug those holes along that boundary with hedgerow planting. Unfortunately, we can't plant trees within the pylon easement, but we can plant hedgerow within the pylon easement. So yeah, the boundaries to the south, which is that boundary and that boundary, all existing landscaping is retained, but any gaps within that landscaping is going to be plugged as well.
And would the hedging that is going to be put there, is it going to be evergreen to basically make sure that at all times of the year it's going to be give some coverage, yes, in that area.
It'll be what
I mean, basically, those hedgerows are bare for what 5-6 months of the year. I do believe that we should try and improve on that.
The hedgerows proposed will be native, which will likely to be hawthorn, which aren't evergreen.
Yeah.
But what I would say to that is there aren't a huge amount of gaps in the hedgerow. The main boundary is to the south, which is this one, which is very close to these houses that are going to be built in the future. That boundary is here. So you can see this is Old Houses Lane. There's hedgerow to either side of that road. The gaps are small, and where the hedgerow is retained, that isn't evergreen. So I think it probably would look a bit odd to have a small clump of evergreen hedgerow within a continuous line of hedgerow that isn't evergreen, if that makes sense. But because of this double hedgerow and the height of that hedgerow, then obviously it still will provide a good cover for safeguarding neighbouring amenity and views of the development.
All this is overgrown, isn't it? Basically, nobody seems to bother cutting these hedges.
Yeah.
So I'm going to say, obviously, it's untidy. Who would be responsible for the maintenance of the hedgerow?
It'll be the landowner. So the applicant will be responsible for this hedgerow along this boundary, which is that boundary and that boundary. And then the landowner, obviously, the opposite side of Old House Lane will be responsible for that hedgerow. Now, we do have pretty sure the landscaping scheme refers to a minimum maintenance height of 3 metres for the hedgerow. That's on landscape plan. There isn't a condition I proposed to ensure that the hedgerows are maintained at 3 metres, but obviously that is within the committee's jurisdiction to impose such a condition if they feel it necessary. I don't think it necessary, bearing in mind the relationship that houses have to the application site. There are, where we can, get new tree plants in there, and you do have height from this existing group of trees in this corner here as well, which does provide a good buffer to this house. But like I say, it is in the members' control to apply a condition for a minimum 3 metre hedge line if necessary.
That little lane's still going to be there, isn't it?
Yeah.
So basically, on one side, it looks as though it is sort of cared for. On the other side, it's just overgrown. I think.
Just at the point when the picture was taken, but the landscape strategy for the outline housing scheme, that shows retention of other hedgerows to the south of Old House Lane along that route. It shows for new tree planting, and again, like the strategy for the current application, the plugging of gaps in hedgerows as well. I think it's important to emphasise that there is quite a substantial setback of the built form from Old House Lane. There is a fence line within there, but all the existing landscaping is retained and is going to be new to false what's there at the moment as well. So there will be a strong landscape buffer to the south of the application site, as well as a landscape buffer, if you will, to the north of what will be the new housing development as well, with Old House Lane running in between.
Mhm. Yeah, I still feel that the hedgerow should be maintained and not just ignored, because gaps can form if nobody bothers about them, in terms of laying them and making sure that they, there are obligations for these landowners. I mean, it's not just about making money out of their buildings. It's about,
I suppose it's a bit of a catch-22 because obviously the overgrown nature of the hedgerows either side, they add to the character of Old House Lane, but if they're allowed just to mature to whatever height they want, assuming there's no conflict with the pylon line, obviously that will add to the screening afforded to the development as well. So
Are you leaving it there or are you proposing?
I feel that there should be a condition in terms of the maintenance and of that hedgerow.
No.
It is going to be a built-up area, but that's obvious.
I think Andrew's checking for me, but there is a condition, I'm sure, that
Just
requires the
looking at that
maintenance of
aspect.
landscaping.
Sorry, can I help on that one? If you look on the agenda papers at page 38, we've got condition 23, which sets out the landscaping scheme that's been provided with the application is implemented unless there is an alternative scheme agreed. And then we've got condition 24, which refers to the management and maintenance scheme of the landscaped areas to be submitted. It seems from the discussion that there is a concern about whether the planting is going to be effectively maintained. And that's where condition 4 comes in, because that requires the maintenance arrangements to be agreed. So I think that point is I think the concerns you make are understood given the nature of the area at present and how it will be once the development on this site and the adjoining site comes forward. But I think condition 24 gives us that control to make sure that the rural lane nature or the hedge flanked rural lane will be a hedge flanked rural lane following the development.
And Councillor Pittman, if I can say that, your intervention strengthens the fact that there is a concern there regarding that aspect of it. It's covered by the condition, but officers are aware that this is particularly important. So are you satisfied that we can?
I just, my concern is that the bound. They're not interested in.
Once that management strategy is agreed, then obviously they will be bound by that strategy. If they're found to be not implemented in accordance with that strategy, that will allow us then to progress enforcement proceedings against them.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Nixon.
Thank you, Chair. At the 61 car parking spaces, which I'm assuming that's been derived by some sort of a calculation.
Sorry, I missed that.
Parking standards. Parking standards and the supplementary.
Yeah,
plan on
so
top
that's
of
been
that.
derived, right, which is fine.
Am I right in saying it's slightly above the necessary?
is.
Yes,
Yeah.
but
It is.
only
It-
just.
It's informed by the adopted car parking standards now.
Yeah, it gives 7.5 spaces per unit, basically. I've worked it out.
And-
But then if you take off the electric and the disabled, it gives a bit.
Yeah,
less than
what I
that.
would say though is that assessment's based on a worst case scenario.
Yeah.
So we've got the EG land use, which is a much higher car parking generator compared to a storage and distribution, which is much lower.
Yeah,
So it's developed, if you will, future-proofed on the basis that all of the units come forward for the higher car parking generator use.
that's good. I thought it would have been worked out properly. But is there any way of making sure that the people that are working in those units park in those spaces? Because if you go on on the pavements, on the roads, it's blocked a lot of the time. More over on the White Hill side of it, but and then you look at the car parks and they're empty. You think, what's going on? Why don't they park in the car parks? Can they not get out at night time or something? Is there any way?
The times I've
of
been
that?
to this site, there isn't a car parking issue, an on-street car parking issue with this area of White Hills. Obviously, it's segregated by access from the larger part of White Hills. The best way to stop displacement from the site is by providing the right amount of car parking. Unfortunately, though, you can't stop somebody parking in an easier location. I have experience of that dealing with different school applications, and you can provide all the children drop-off places you want to within that site, but because it's easier for mums and dads to drop off on the road, then that's what will continue to happen. So that parking becomes redundant, really.
Could I
way
come
to
in, Rob, because you might be saying this, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but I know in terms of schools, for example, you know, where people park, etc., is a really thorny issue. I would say that probably there's a responsibility upon the employer, the user of the site. I think you know what I'm going to say. The user of the site, although it's not obligatory, but to really impress upon their employees the inconvenience it causes, particularly when provision through the planning process has provided adequate car parking. So it does not reflect well on the users of that space if the parking allocation that's been passed by this committee, for example, is then ignored and abused in a way, because they're going to be empty parking spaces there. And I would say, just like schools have to work with their constituency, that is parents and users of the school, employers have that relationship as well with their employees to really impress upon them the need to use those car parking spaces unless there are exceptional circumstances where they have to park elsewhere. But am I right in saying that that is something that we can impress upon the employees, but it's up to them then, isn't it?
Yeah, I can certainly have that conversation with them, but as far as kind of control that the planning process has, it's minimal. The best way to prevent on-street parking would be through double yellow lines along Jenny Lane, those kind of things. But the Highway Authority would only ever do that if there's justification to do so, and that justification would be relative to car parking on Jenny Lane, and that car parking then causing an issue for highway safety.
I suppose only time will tell with that one, won't it? I'm
Yeah, I
happy to
mean,
support
like I
the
say,
application because it's good and it's
we
bringing
can only
employment
we can only future-proof it by providing the appropriate amount of car parking. I can't see why, when somebody has access to a parking space, they would choose to park on Jenny Lane, because yes, you have that perimeter footpath, but obviously the car parking areas are much closer to the buildings anyway. So, but why that happens on White Hills, I don't know.
No, and it does. It's
yes.
massive on White Hill.
It is a
does.
problem.
Yeah, thank you.
Did you second the proposal? Okay. Vice Chair just wants to come in.
Thank you. Yeah, if I may, just on the issue of parking there, I think first of all, the other part of White Hills, the parking policy, and I believe it was national park policy in the late 90s, early 2000s, was something like one space per 4 employees. That's been superseded, so I don't think that's going to be an issue. But on the matter of Jenny Lane, I don't know if it still is. Years ago, I used to work at Field Park, and Jenny Lane was de-restricted, its national speed limit, from the bottom roundabout up to the roundabout by Field Park. I don't know if it still is. If it is, there is certainly potentially an issue for people parking on that lane. I don't know if you know, Rob, whether it's still, I know highways have said there's no issue, but
Are we talking on parking on Jenny Lane?
yes.
I mean, sorry, it's only a reactionary action that the highway authority can take when the problem occurs for displacement of cars. Okay,
Thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Councillor Goodman, but I'm just going to clarify, Councillor Goodman, your status is that Councillor Goodman will be a new member of the Planning Committee, but she hasn't completed all of her training yet. And apparently, because she's completed a section of the training, she is allowed, I think this is right, isn't it? Just to confirm that, she is allowed to ask questions, but she can't vote. I think that's the case. I mean, whether she can involve herself in debate, is that also going to be okay as long as she doesn't vote?
Chairman, if Councillor Goodman is a member of the Planning Committee, then she has the right to take part fully in deliberations of the Planning Committee. If she hasn't completed her training, then she may wish to voluntarily not vote, but there's nothing that we can, none of us can stop Councillor Goodman taking a full part in the deliberations of the Planning Committee and voting if she chooses to.
Okay, so Councillor Goodman, go ahead. You've got free scope to, but it's your decision whether you actually vote at the end of this.
Thank you.
I think you've certainly got a question, I believe. So.
I do, thank you,
Okay,
Chair.
thank you.
It's more clarification, and you've stolen my thunder. I was just going to explain that. I'm in the middle of my training. It finishes on Monday evening. I have done some online training. And now I've had this big build-up. It's probably going to sound a really silly question, but it was more for clarification. I understood the idea of the east-west gable. I thought that was an excellent idea because it doesn't affect the residential area, which is north-south. That's correct, yes. I'm just wondering if we could see a slide again that was toward the very end, where it was mentioned that there are other buildings, obviously still now on site. And it just looked like the building that was shown had got sort of only one side of a gable and the back was completely
Is it
flat.
that slide you're referring to?
It was almost at the very end of your PowerPoint, excuse me.
So
It was just before you started talking about e.g. land use can take place in a residential area. Oh, was it the one just before that?
So this slide shows the ridge of the buildings running east to west, which indicates that the gables are to this
Yes.
and this end.
I think
Same
it may
with
have
this
been the
building
one
and
after
same with
that,
this building.
sorry, that actually showed a real live build. That one, that's the one. Now, I can't see it terribly well from here, but in my head, I've got the feeling of a gable roof like that.
Yeah.
Is that the same at the back? It sort of looked as though it went straight down. from-
No, so
Yeah,
these are the gable ends of the building.
I
These
can
two
see now.
here, which are basically those ends of the building,
yeah,
which then indicates that along this line, along this line, and along this line, it's the lower part of the roof that's exposed to those houses?
Yeah, yeah, I've just seen the screen behind me.
Is that okay?
Yes, that's fine. It was just something completely different from that one view there on the very left-hand side at the back of the building. It almost looked as if it went straight down from the point of the roof. But it is a proper
Yeah, that,
gable end
so those, I mean, this is only what, this is the larger building of the three that are
that's already
proposed.
there. Yeah.
But they're all designed the same, so they all have this gable feature to each end, and they have the lower eaves line to each side of the building. Now that lower eaves line, as I say, is positioned on that east-west axis, as opposed to the north-south, which would put the gables exposed to these houses.
Thank you, that's really helpful for that, thank you.
Good question.
There we are. You got a good question thrown back at you there.
Excellent.
Councillor Farrington, please, next.
Thank you, Chair. At the huge risk of sounding contrary, I just want to circle back on the southern aspect, perimeter points made, because I just have a slightly different view to Councillor Pittman, and I just thought I should put that forward. The picture's shown obviously a snapshot, which you said, Rob, because you can't really see what it's like all year round. But it shows the hedges spilling out and looking very natural, and as far as I can see, it's not encroaching on the public highway. So from my sort of viewpoint, that's a good thing, because, for example, if you hacked that back this time of year, you'd do enormous amounts of damage to nesting birds at a time, for example, where they're feeding their chicks. And I don't really see the necessity to have all our hedgerows manicured. In fact, to quote Wordsworth, sport if wood run wild. It's actually nice to have, leave nature to do its own thing if it's not actually affecting anything else. So I would say, because that boundary sits outside the acoustic fence, and as long as it's not doing any harm to traffic or forcing people into the road who are walking their dogs, etc., I would like to leave it that way. I just wanted to make that point. Okay, thank you.
No, thank you for making that point. I mean, it's a perfectly valid one. Do we need to respond to that in any way, please, Rob?
I don't think so. I mean, what I would obviously highlight is that this bottom left-hand picture kind of illustrates both sides of what members are discussing. We've got this maintained hedge line along here, which kind of does open up views into the back of this property, whereas you've got this more unmaintained appearance, more natural, which has been left to grow to some more substantial height, which would then act to provide better screening to the development. Obviously, bird nesting was mentioned. There is a condition within the advised by officers that any clearance is undertaken outside of the bird nesting season, which is March to August. That doesn't say or mean to say that clearance can't happen. If they want to clear within that period, then they have to do various assessments to demonstrate that there aren't any nesting birds within the hedgerow that's going to be removed. Now, obviously, I think the way discussion has progressed, there's one side who wants a nice, neatly trimmed bush, and there's one side that would like an overgrown one. So it would be, some direction, I suppose, in terms of how members wish officers to maintain the hedgerow to the south of the site would be good. Obviously, part of the next process, if approved, is to approve the management strategy. So it could be left to officers to decide what that best strategy would be, or members could put something into the word in the condition to perhaps advise officers how best to progress with that assessment.
Could I just make a suggestion that in terms of the concerns expressed regarding landscape, etc., because they have been expressed, could we ask that officers are mindful of those concerns, and when they're looking at this particular aspect, you know, in terms of the strategy, bear those comments in mind and those factors that have been raised? Are you satisfied that if we raise it here, we can ask the officer to take that forward and bear in mind what strategy is ultimately developed? Because there are two opposing views and we have to accommodate those. Councillor Collins.
Perhaps,
It's an intervention on this point.
yeah, just specifically on this, yeah. If there are two opposing views on this, I mean, surely we should be sort of like perhaps having a bit more of a debate to find the consensus of opinion amongst the committee, rather than leaving it to the officer to just go away and decide what he thinks is right. Personally, I'd rather see it overgrown. I mean, hedgerows provide more than covered than more than just for nesting birds. There's hedgehogs, there's stoats, weasels, there's all sorts. They provide a corridor for wildlife, and to cut them back, you're nearly turning it back to a desert, really. You know, in terms of little furry animals with teeth. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah. And in a sense, I was sort of proposing, if members are satisfied with what I've suggested, if they're not, then we can certainly go down that route. But if can I just go to the first proposal that I've made, that actually we leave it to officers to decide? If you don't want to do that, then you can obviously vote, and we can then go down a different path, as Councillor Collins said. But I'm just suggesting a way forward that we ask the officers to take on board the comments that have been made, particularly by Councillor Pittman and also by Councillor Farrington. So I'm going to propose that. Do you want to go that way, or do you want to go down a way where we decide which one, manicured or more natural?
Councillor Nixon coming on.
Before we decide, can we just have, I mean, these hedgerows they're quite substantial, and I get that. They're not going to stay as they are in that picture. They're going to grow, and they will need a degree of maintenance to ensure that the safety of the road users. Nobody's suggesting, I don't think anybody's suggesting that the crop down like that picture on the bottom left, because that looks like somebody who lives in that property or uses that land. But as they are now, they look okay. They're not impinging on the road, but there must have to be some sort of maintenance level with them. Otherwise, they will just grow on the road. They'll cause a danger.
Councillor Pittman, did you want to come back, because you contributed to this earlier on?
I have experience of overgrown hedges. I don't know whether you're aware of Hillock Lane, which goes up onto Kirkham Road. And basically, the overgrown hedgerows, very overgrown, and interfering in cars, where cars end up in the hedgerow. I'm not suggesting, you know, we're going to go down to that particular level on the left-hand side, but basically they should be maintained so that they do not interfere. It's good to have a good hedgerow, but it hasn't got to end up where they're becoming trees and they're basically so high that they look a bit, I would say silly, but it can interfere with traffic. It certainly can, where cars are passing and heavy goods vehicles are coming along. So my experience is you've got to maintain to a reasonable level.
Okay, we seem to have two positions. I'm going to bring Andrew in here, might be able to clarify a couple of issues.
Just myself, Richard.
Okay, Rob, sorry.
Yeah, I think looking into the discussion, there's probably two matters for consideration. There's obviously the width of the hedgerow and impact on highway safety, and then there's the height of the hedgerow, which could conflict with a pylon line. So as long as those two matters are addressed, then would members be happy with that strategy on board?
I think that's a really sensible option, because it covers both areas. If you're in favour of that, can you just indicate and put your hands up, please, so that we ensure that we've got support for that? Thank you. Yes.
Chairman, I think perhaps one way of dealing with that, if I can come in, would be if we look at condition 24, which is the one I referenced earlier and deals with the maintenance of landscaping. There's a requirement at the moment that there's a scheme submitted. There could be an addition to that sentence that sets out that the scheme shall confirm elements of the landscaping that are to be left in a less maintained state to provide the wildlife coverage and habitat that I think a number of members have raised.
Yeah.
But would also cover the requirements that the developer has to meet in terms of providing a suitable width of the road, to make sure that the landscaping underneath the pylons doesn't become overgrown, and sort of those safety matters, whilst providing other elements that obviously deliver more natural habitat that Councillor Farrington, Councillor Collins, and Councillor Nixon and Councillor Pittman have all alluded to.
Okay, thank you. Are members happy with that approach? They'll accommodate that within the conditions, etc.
With Councillor Evans and
with-
Councillor Nixon who proposed this.
Yes, okay, yes, but we'll put that in, okay. I think Councillor Settle was waiting patiently to speak, so I'm going to let him in.
That's an interesting debate. This is a bit boring. Can you just put a bit of context into the where the site is, though, Rob? Your very first slide of the Google view, and you mentioned the housing to the south, but one of the slides mentioned south and east. I just want to get a bit of context. That's all.
Best way to describe M55 junction.
Yeah.
And then we got across the new road that runs off obviously down to Kirkby, down Livingston's way.
There's B&Q on the right hand side. Yeah.
Big Tesco,
Yeah.
Macallan, Next, those kind of things. Then you got the continuation of the M55.
Yeah.
And down to the roundabout junction where the Mercedes garage is and the Volkswagen
Yeah.
garage. Then you take a left, and then a right into Progress Way, which then takes you down to Squires Gate
Yeah.
Lane, Morrison's Lane. So yeah,
Well, underneath the red line, you got the housing.
Jenny Lane's on
Yeah.
obviously the main access. It's hard to describe, but there's no housing here at the moment. There's 2 houses here and 2 houses here. At the moment, obviously we've got green fields which tie in with the housing allocation, so the mixed use allocation, which we've got a housing scheme on, what we're assessing at the moment.
And that's the one to the south, is it?
Yeah, so the mixed use allocation and the outline application we're considering is in this land in here.
Yeah, and there's one to the east, it says on the slide. Is it?
Rob, would it help to point out where Cropper Lane is?
The house to the east is in here. That well in there. It's a single dwelling.
I sort of got the impression there's going to be more houses because the slide says south and east.
No, it's this.
It's only the south.
It's that property.
Well, there's no more housing there.
This one, sorry?
There's not going to be any more housing there.
No, no.
All right,
Right,
on the slide says south and
These
east.
existing- These green circles indicate the existing houses, so
Yeah.
they're 2 pair of semi-detached houses. This, if you can see the overlay
Yeah,
put on of this housing development here, that's the outline of the centre.
right, that's the southern one. Okay, I got it. Thanks. That's always 5 times bigger than you first think when you near B&Q. It's enormous. Thanks for the clarification. Thanks.
Thank you. Can I ask Councillor Evans? Yeah.
Just keep it brief, Chair. Just wanted to clarify something. On previous applications around the industrial estates there, when I asked about potential parking restrictions on the road, I think I'm right in saying that I was told that it was classed as private land still, so it wasn't actually under Lancashire Highways remit to put parking restrictions on there. Am I right in thinking that this land is also built on private land, so that is also the case? And if that is the case, is it, again, I'm guilty of answering my own questions here, if we put a condition on the owner of the land to maybe put some double yellows on the pinch point where the access to this proposed development is, would that almost push people who are likely to park on the roadside further away from the site? But if you could address the initial question, I'd appreciate it.
Path forward for you, Councillor
Good
Evans.
question. Andrew's just checking the adopted status of Jenny Lane, I think it is adopted on the basis that it links to the roundabout on Progress Way. So this roundabout here, there's also a bus service that runs up Jenny Lane that culminates in the Peel Park site here. So I think it will be adopted. I'm just checking. In terms of traffic regulation orders, we can't enforce that the applicant enters into a TRO agreement with the Highway Authority. There needs to be justification to it, and there isn't justification at the moment because we don't know whether there's going to be cars displaced into the road. But equally, it's the TROs under separate highway legislation, which are subject to their own round of public consultation. That public consultation could end up in objections to the TRO, and effectively that TRO not ever coming forward. So the planning can't impose stipulation on development which is governed by other legislation, unfortunately. Notwithstanding the fact, I don't think, well, there isn't an argument for the TRO at the moment because there isn't the displacement from the development to demonstrate.
Yeah, thanks for that clarification, Rob.
Thank you, Councillor.
And it is adopted. So the whole of this road network, including Jenny Lane and the offshoot to the left, including the route round the roundabout, is adopted.
Are there any further comments, questions made from members? No? Okay, we have Councillor Evans who has proposed and Councillor Nixon who has seconded this particular application. All those in favour, please indicate. All those against? Abstentions? That was... Okay. Do we register as an abstention? I think Councillor Goodman, who's just put a... Or, yeah, she can abstain. Yes?
Yeah, yes, you can. We wouldn't
Okay.
normally record abstentions in the minutes, Chairman.
No, okay, all right. Thank you. Thank you for that. Now we're going to have a little comfort break.
Wow. It is unusual, it's very unusual. Just comfort breaks depend on why.
Very good.
When I saw the picture, so that's what I have seen. I've already imagined this. I mean, I think it was just the animals. Maybe I should. Okay, yeah, I do. But I have a feeling that most people whereas I was actually onto the panel anyway, not to do, I wanted to be. Yeah, I think that's what Catherine said, when you ask questions as part of the learning process. And then of course they got I just can't. Which is quite clear why my colleagues are remaining confused about it. I'll do it. I'm just not well, yesterday.
Yeah, exactly. Well, or I'm not gonna be able to get that from the motor. Oh, you need to get it right.
There you go.
Okay. Let's have a drink. That's it. Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know. The answer from the other two people is, we're not trained. I said, well, nor am I. You can easily be trained. So I uploaded
That's the external.
yeah. Well, I enjoyed the protection wise. And I thought, well,
Yeah.
it didn't really seem fair that I was taking on 3 committees. I don't mind. And the other 2 people, I only had 1 each. So I'm going to do planning.
Yeah,
You should really take. I think it makes the business sound, you know, I don't want to be awkward.
but what Gordon was saying earlier, you were quite frustrated with this. What's the materialised? You will do something, say,
Yeah.
but like to make the actual
Yeah.
Play the guy at once on the side.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I was in nurse go in. Well, he was on holiday.
I know.
Yeah, yeah. 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 Go away. Yeah, go away.
Elise's mum just come out of hospital. Yeah, she left the thing, she's my sister. All right, so she's just come out. I think Elise, yeah, absolutely. She looks old.
Thank you so much.
Oh, she's adamant, she's carrying on. Johnny's given up with it all. So it's up to her. Because he gets so angry and frustrated and nothing happening. But the court case, it's still going, Elise is the last one. Yeah, so. Right, so she's going next one on her own now. Right. Not her, just loses his right and start shouting and screaming about it all. Right, so, yeah, right. She wants to sort it, yeah. And I remember she's got a lot of stuff coming out. Got nursery. Fine. That's all of it around you. But Meg's home now. She came home last week. She was sick here. I think she's got carers. She's quite old. Well, late 70s, but been on her own. Died early. She's really just kind of lost the world. You can't give up. She thinks at least she'll be on house. So, you know what I mean? Yeah, so she thinks she should be doing it all, and that's not so. And the guilt is killing her. She says she can't do it, that's all. So I think with being in hospital, breathing and well, she's got to get her house today. She's got to get I mean, at my age, yeah, I've got 2 daughters. That's what my dad's doing. I've got 2 daughters.
Okay, members, thank you for that. Can we look at item 2, please, on page 42, which is the retention, the proposal retention of 4 existing temporary accommodation units as permanent accommodation, consisting of 77 rooms with ensuite facilities and ancillary break kitchen telecoms rooms. There are no speakers on this, so I'll ask the officer, Andrew in this case, to make his presentation, and then we'll go for questions and the debate.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, as we say, this is an application at Kirkham Prison, which I'm sure we all know is located between Kirkham and Freckleton on the plan there. It's a Category D prison, been there a long time. The site is within the green belt in the local plan, so that brings with it a requirement to satisfy policy GD2 and also national greenbelt planning requirements, which we'll discuss in a second. The application is a retrospective application. When the COVID pandemic hit and the social distancing rules were in place, there were some permitted development rights introduced by the government, which allowed for the introduction of new buildings at sites like prisons and hospitals and the like, without the need for planning permission. So these additional buildings were installed, erected at the prison at that time, and didn't need planning permission because they were permitted development. The permitted development rights that were installed were temporary though, so and they've not been renewed. So once those rights expired in December 21, these buildings required planning permission or required to be removed, and they've not been removed, hence we've got this application. In terms of consultations, the Parish Council at Freckleton and the Town Council at Kirkham, neither have any objections to it, and there haven't been any neighbour comments either. But it is a major scale development, which is why it needs to come to committee today. The officer recommendation is to support the scheme, but there are some drainage issues which I'll touch on also. So this is an aerial image of the prison. So this is Kirkham Road as you come round the bends from Freckleton towards Kirkham. The prison entrance is here. There's the farm shop at the entrance there. And then you come on past the prison, past the weighbridge, the commercial vehicle weighbridge and the industrial estate, and the traffic lights at the Kirkham bypass are just off the image here. So the nearest residential properties are these here in this corner at the Mead, and then you can see obviously the various accommodation within the prison. So this is before the buildings were installed in 20. And this is the buildings that have been installed. So I put the red squares around them so you can see that they are slotted into parts of the prison where there previously were open space. The buildings themselves, fairly unremarkable, single story, modular type buildings. There's 4 of them. This is obviously a picture of 2 of them, but the other 2 look the same. Internal layouts, fairly straightforward, simple stuff. Central corridor with a series of prisoner accommodation cells down each side of the central corridor, and then a kind of a staff welfare office type arrangement in the centre. This is a site plan, so this is showing the buildings in question. This is a drainage plan on the left, and this is the reason that the application's been with us for so long. When we undertook consultation on the application initially, United Utilities said that's fine, but we want some details of the drainage prior to the development commencing. So, with it being a retrospective application, so that's fairly pointless. So we asked the Ministry of Justice, who are the applicant, for the drainage information up front. And it's unfortunately taken them from July 23 to last month to provide that information. But they now have provided it, and it's with United Utilities for their thoughts. It's providing a fairly standard drainage arrangement whereby the drainage from the buildings is collected through the gutters, runs through a sewer to a central point here, where it's held in storage crates and released into the drainage system at a controlled rate. So I'm fully expecting that United Utilities will be satisfied with that, but at this stage I don't have their comments. So no doubt there can't be any argument over the principle, because it's what happens in all developments. Whether they have a query over the outlet and the rate of discharge, then that's for them to look at technically. And if they have any concerns over it, obviously we'll go back to the Ministry of Justice to get those concerns addressed before any decision is made. But that's the reason for the application being with us for so long. We've just been looking to try and resolve this drainage issue. Turning to the main issues that we've got, obviously the history is as I explained earlier. In terms of the Greenbelt situation, Greenbelt policy is most restrictive land use designation that we have in the borough. New buildings within Greenbelts are defined as being inappropriate development, and inappropriate development should not be supported. But there are a small number of exemptions to what is inappropriate development. And one of those is it's paragraph 154E of the NPPF, which allows for limited infilling of previously developed land. Now, if I go back to this image, the whole prison site would be counted as previously developed land. It's whilst there may not have been buildings on these particular areas of open space within that site, the site as a whole is a previously developed site. So we are able to look at whether infilling is occurring, and the test for that is whether there is an impact on this on the openness of the Greenbelt. So once we accept it's previously developed land, once we accept it's infilling, we then need to look at whether it's impacting on the openness of the Greenbelt. And I think with the situation of these buildings, they are sited within the middle of the prison complex. So they're not extending, for example, they're not over here in this field where they're bringing the prison out wider. All views across the site from the public vantage points and from the dwellings, these buildings are set in against the backdrop of other buildings or are screened by other buildings. They're also obviously low buildings, and there's also the landscaping around them that further helps mitigate any impact on the openness. So with those points in mind, my view is that they do satisfy this exemption in terms of the Greenbelt planning policy, and therefore they satisfy policy GD2 and are acceptable in principle. The only other point on the sheet here is one of sort of an increase in prisoner capacity. That has risen as a consequence of this. As the social distancing rules have relaxed, the prisoner capacity, there's extra capacity on site because there's more cells, and that has allowed the prison capacity to go up to just under 700 actually, from the information I've got. That brings with it an increase in activity as there's presumably more staff and more visitors to the prison. But where it is, it's on the main highway network, and it's not perhaps a material change, and it's not something that, for example, the Highway Authority have raised any concerns over. So don't believe that scale of impact that's clearly occurred over the last 5 years anyway, or 4 years, is something that's a particular concern to us. I've covered the drainage point, so my only bullet there is the summary that asks that we delegate the decision to officers to approve it once the drainage matter is satisfactorily resolved.
Thank you, Andrew. Councillor Settle, and then Councillor Ledger, I think. Yeah. And then Councillor Collins.
Thank you, Chairman. Very small buildings in the middle of this site. Can't see a problem. I propose we accept.
Well, we've got a proposal, and obviously we'll keep asking if there are any questions and have a debate first. But okay, thank you for that, Councillor Settle. Councillor Ledger.
Thank you, Chair. I was just curious about the buildings themselves. So I appreciate they were built during COVID, and they essentially were emergency buildings. You know, they look like the temporary buildings I had at school that were built 40 years before I was born, but not temporary. Would your advice still be to permit this development, say it was a new development, to that standard of building rather than a proper permanent structure?
Yeah, I think there's perhaps two elements. There's one element whether the buildings are acceptable for the use, and I can only assume that they are in terms of the scale of the prisoner accommodation that's offered must meet the standards that the minimum of the Ministry of Justice need to work to. The second question is perhaps more of a planning one about the aesthetics and the quality of the buildings, and as you say, you know, they are relatively mediocre in terms of the design, functional. And if we were looking at this as a planning application, I think we would be having well, we are looking at it as a planning application, but if we were looking at it as a prospective planning application, I think we would be having a discussion with the applicant about the quality of the accommodation, the design of the building, you know, whether it could be more. Clearly, it needs to serve a purpose and it needs to be delivered to a price. But there's perhaps more of a quality finish might be what we will look for, notwithstanding that it's a site that's not particularly visible and is located within the centre of a prison complex. But obviously, we're not looking at that. We're looking at this in a retrospective way, and that brings forward the question to me that if we were to refuse the application because we weren't satisfied that the buildings were of a suitable design, would it be expedient to pursue enforcement action to require their removal? And I think that's probably, well, I think it would be unlikely for us to come to that conclusion. So, given the context of the application that we've got being a retrospective one, that's why you know I've put it forward with a recommendation I have to accept this on the basis that it probably wouldn't justify pursuing formal action to require that these are removed, and a preferable design is brought forward for them.
I think one of the key points, Councillor Ledger, as well, is that, you know, there's a planning requirement here, obviously, in consideration. There's also a Ministry of Justice standard in terms of, you know, suitable accommodation, its setting within the existing prison. And so judgments have already been made from the Ministry of Justice point of view that this is appropriate and suitable. But I take your point because it's one I actually raised with the officers at an earlier stage. Councillor Collins.
Yeah, can I assist on that? I think the issue there is it's talking about the buildings themselves being temporary that are being replaced, as opposed to here, we're talking about temporary buildings going into a previous developed land. So what it's saying is that if a site has got temporary buildings on it, that doesn't make it previous developed land. It's the other way around, I think. The point of the paragraph is that if you have a site that has some temporary buildings on it, that shouldn't be used as an excuse for building in the greenbelt. What's being proposed here are temporary buildings on a well-established site. So, yeah. No. Yeah. Yes, but the point of the paragraph is to stop temporary sites becoming permanent. However, whilst these buildings are temporary, the site, the prison, has been there and is well established.
I'm not against this, and you know, I think it's needed, and it is well shielded, and it's not visible. The parish council's dogs are checked, but it does appear to go against 154G, the exceptions in 154G, which specifically precludes temporary buildings.
I think the point that 154G refers to is, if we imagine this field here, the other side of the road, and if there had been a temporary planning permission during the COVID period to put temporary buildings on that field, because there was nowhere else to put buildings on the site, and that the prison owned that field as well, then paragraph 154G would not apply to that site, because it is only previous developed by virtue of having temporary buildings on it. That's not the same here, where the whole site is previously developed land because it contains a range of permanent buildings. The only temporary buildings on this site are the ones that are the subject of this planning application, and that's why paragraph 154G, as you correctly correct me on, applies here, whereas it wouldn't apply if we were having an application to regularise or make permanent planning permission for some temporary buildings that have been put onto this site, because that clearly wouldn't be previously developed land, because it's not previously developed, other than it had these hypothetical temporary buildings on them.
The exception is limited infilling or the partial or complete redevelopment of previously development land, whether redundant or in continuing use, excluding temporary buildings.
So the whole
Yeah.
site, the whole prison site.
No, well, you
we
can't
see on the
infill the whole
western,
site, you're infilling part of the site.
you're infilling part of the prison site as a whole. Kirkham Prison is previously developed land, because there are a range of buildings and open space, they're curtilage within them. So in the same way that these houses on the Mead are previously developed land with the various prison buildings and car parks and what have you, that exercise yards and the like that a prison requires. So that makes the prison site previously developed land. It's not previously developed by virtue of having just some temporary buildings on it, because it has a range of permanent buildings on it that have been there for decades. Therefore, it is previously developed land. Therefore, a proposal that involves infilling of that land can satisfy paragraph 154.
No, I'm not convinced at all. I really am not.
Bring Mark in, thank you.
Yeah. I think also you have to have regard to the fact that in the annex, there's a definition of previous developed land. And that says land which is or was occupied by a permanent structure, including the curtilage of the developed land. So I think the issue here is that if that had just been a temporary prison, it had been, say, set up in COVID, it hadn't been there for years, and then they applied for permission to keep it, that would be the circumstances that you're setting out. However, what we've got here are many other buildings on there which are long established and are not temporary. Therefore, the site as a whole is not a temporary facility, and therefore that paragraph G of 154 applies. So if it had, like I say, so if we'd have had, just a farmer's field that was set up as a temporary prison during COVID, then you wouldn't be able to use that paragraph to say it should remain. However, the prison has been there for a long time, and therefore that's not what that is looking at.
You're talking about previously developed land, but it's limited infilling or partial or complete redevelopment. Now, you can't have infill unless you've already got buildings there, either side. We're talking about infill. Now, those are the two. If it was infill, yes, that applies. If it was partial or complete redevelopment of previous development land, yeah, fair enough. But it specifically excludes temporary buildings, and to my mind, that seems to be there because someone could apply for a temporary building for 6 months, whatever, then come along a little bit later on and say, well, I've got a temporary building here, I want to make it permanent, and that specifically precludes that.
That's
And
right.
I think those circumstances apply to here. There's no doubt it's a temporary building. It's infill. You're not talking about previously developed land. It is infill. Yeah. And it specifically precludes temporary buildings. So I really am not. I'm not against the scheme. I'm quite happy for it to go ahead. But reading the wording of it, which is what we do. We look at the policies and we apply the policies, and that's our guidelines. And I'm still not convinced by the officers. I mean, they could well be right, but my understanding and my grasp of the English language, I think, I read that, and to me, temporary buildings are precluded from exception G.
Your interpretation, and you're entitled to that. I'm just going to bring in Ian Curtis from a legal point of view, because I think clarification might be helpful on this.
Yeah, Chairman, I agree with the interpretation that's been put forward by the officers. It seems to me to be the only interpretation of the words in brackets that lends any sense to the paragraph. But in any event, you have the advice of your officers. Members are of course free to agree with that advice or not to agree with the advice. But the advice of your officers on this occasion is, as you've heard from the planning officers.
Thank you for that. So I hope that's helpful. Councillor Evans.
Thank you, Chair. I've got some sympathy from both sides of what we've just been hearing, and I think if you draw a line between I'll draw a thread through what Councillor Ledger and Councillor Collins both said. I don't think any of us really would say that temporary accommodation, as this is the absolute ideal, because it is by nature meant to be temporary accommodation, and if it's then turned into something which is long term, and I think we've all had experiences of temporary buildings at school that were used way past their best operational period, then it doesn't bode well for the future in terms of those prisoners' experience within those buildings, and also it's a concern that those buildings will become dilapidated and will be used beyond their reasonable lifetime. I'm just wondering whether, listening to what we've just been listening to, which are really valid points, although I do agree with the officers that their interpretation of it is because it's within an existing site that you could utilise and apply the rules the way they've been applied or suggested. I'm just wondering whether we could put some kind of sub-note or a condition on them, on those, that on the basis that the application time has lapsed already from 2021 to now 2024, whether we could say that while we accept that these buildings are indeed a temporary structure, that we would be looking beyond a certain time frame for those buildings to be redeveloped as more permanent and more suitable accommodation into the future, which obviously we're all aware that there's a shortage of prison places, and we all know that those buildings have been used since COVID for a higher proportion of people. So it isn't having a detrimental impact on the surrounding area as we see. There's no objections from parish or from any of the bodies that are there. I do think it is important, Andrew, that we do get clarification for United Utilities, because that word seems to be acceptable. That needs firming up, but I'm just wondering whether or not there is anything that we could put in with substantial teeth that maybe gave them a time limited period to keep those buildings operational before they became more substantial. Thank you.
A number of questions there, Andrew, please.
Yeah, I think it would be possible to impose a planning condition to time limit the planning permission, so that the buildings have to be cleared in X years. But the query would be whether what that time period is. Are the buildings designed for a 10-year period? Are they designed for a 40-year period? And if it's going to be the latter, is a condition of that nature realistically going to be an enforceable one for us to require that the buildings are replaced or removed by 2026 or whatever it might be, 2064. Do the maths right. I'm not sure that it would be, and I think it would be preferable to rely on legislation that requires prisoners to be given a suitable standard of accommodation whilst they're in prison, to deal with that aspect, rather than the planning authority put a condition on today that in 30, 20, 40, however many years' time, someone's going to look at and think, well, how do we know whether this is still suitable or not? I think it's obviously it's a valid point, but I don't think it's a point that we would be best placed getting involved in terms of our decision today.
I mean, in terms of the United Utilities, obviously that's a real concern, isn't it? That
that definitely is. Yeah,
planning permission will be suspended until that is satisfactorily sorted out.
Yeah, this has been on my desk for over 12 months now, waiting for the information. Yeah. I've sent it off to United Utilities the day I got it. I've had an acknowledgement from them to say they're going to look at it, but I haven't got their views back. So I'm expecting that it will be resolved, and I won't be, if the recommendation is accepted by committee today, I certainly won't be issuing the planning permission until United Utilities tell me that the drainage arrangements that are proposed are acceptable.
Okay, some reassurance then.
Councillor Collins wanted to come back in on this point, and Councillor Ledger on this point.
Well, Councillor Farrington was first, so I'm going to go to Councillor Farrington, then I'll come back to Councillor Collins. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. It does connect directly to this point, actually. Just listening to what you just said, Andrew, I sort of agree with you, but we sort of, again, we talk about real world scenarios where, you know, you pass something through and then it becomes dilapidated down the line and prisoners end up in a poor conditions, maybe detrimental to their health. And because of the squeeze on accommodation, as you can see again with all the old style prisons where you get three in the cell and sewage coming up through the loos, you know, and all sorts of stuff. We've all read the reports that in the real world, I think we have to not just rely on things to neatly happen as we'd all would like. I think if we're actually at the planning stage and we've got a voice, you have to sort of head these things off at the pass, in my opinion. And yeah, the analogy's been made with temporary accommodation at school annexes. And, you know, I've sat in one where there was buckets under the roof because it was built, you know, it was put there 10 years with a purpose for after 2 to be replaced, but wasn't. And what we don't know here, the imponderable, is the robustness of those temporary accommodations. I mean, there's a bit of a clue in the name, temporary, but if we pass this through, then what we're doing is giving it permanency. And the problem with that is that all temporary accommodation has a shelf life, and we don't know, as has been admitted here, how good these buildings are. Are they warm in winter? Will those flat roofs leak at some stage? How good are they? And I have huge reservations about passing this through, because I just think that you're potentially creating or waving through something that become problematic and detrimental to people's health and well-being in a few years, because I could see those still being there in 20 years because of the budget squeeze within the prison service system as a whole in terms of builds. So yeah, I am worried about it. And just to conclude, I'd say that I think I would agree with a couple of points raised by my colleagues, that we should have conditions to replace. We should first understand what the shelf life is, and then if we understand that these things are only meant to have a max of 10 years, we should actually impose the condition that they must be replaced after 10 years. Thank you.
I'm just conscious, and I think we could, it's all a very valid debate and some really good questions coming in here. I think we need some clarification in terms of what our powers are as a planning authority and what the powers are in terms of the Ministry of Justice, who are responsible for the provision for, and I'm just wondering whether we're slightly going into territory that is beyond our authority, because I would imagine that the Ministry of Justice will have to maintain, will have to monitor existing accommodation as they do with new accommodation, and therefore are we entering territory that is beyond the authority of the local planning authority? That's where I'm concerned, because to be fair, all the points you've raised are the sort of points that when you're looking at this application will come up in your own mind, and your concerns are shared, I think, by certainly myself. What I really wanted to be very clear is, you know, what grounds do we have in terms of on planning remit to intervene in what is a Ministry of Justice run institution, who are responsible for those, you know, they have to work to certain standards, I presume, and they deem that this is acceptable in terms of, you know, this particular planning application. And I think again, I'd like some sort of legal advice there from other colleagues as well, Andrew, Mark and Ian, in terms of, you know, whilst they're legitimate concerns, I think it's my job as chair to sort of ensure that we are deliberating on matters that are pertinent to us as a planning committee, rather than just exercising our concerns, which are human, about the nature of temporary accommodation, etc., and the provision for prisoners and the state of it, and whether we put a 10-year, you know, I'm not sure that we can do that, but I think there are questions to be asked. So I'd like them. Yeah, back to you, Andrew.
I think there's perhaps two strands that have been raised. There's one over the aesthetics and the design quality of the building, and then there's a second over the structural integrity and suitability of them as a long-term provision of prisoner accommodation. So one solution could be to that the committee authorise officers to impose an additional condition to those listed on the agenda papers that ensures that rather than this being making temporary buildings permanent, it is a temporary planning permission that ensures that after the expiration of 10, 15, 20, whatever years from the grant of planning permission, those buildings are removed. Rather than a suggestion that was made about the buildings being replaced, that's compound or repeating the aesthetics and the issue. So if the committee were minded, you could impose a condition that time limited the planning permission and meant that the Ministry of Justice had to come up with an alternative solution within whatever time frame that committee felt was appropriate. So committee could either put a time frame to me, or you could ask that I go back to the Ministry of Justice and find out what the design life of these buildings are, and then limit it to that.
Ian, can you come in, please? Because I think it's pertinent to have a legal advice at this stage. In terms
Yes,
of
Chairman, I'm
said.
quoting from the planning practice guidance here. Under section 72 of the Town and Country Planning Act, the local planning authority may grant planning permission for a specified temporary period only. So there is power to grant a temporary planning permission, as Andrew's described. Then the guidance goes into circumstances where it might be appropriate, and there's two broadly. Circumstances where a temporary permission may be appropriate include where a trial run is needed in order to assess the effect of the development on the area, or where it's expected that planning circumstances will change in a particular way. Well, that's clearly not the case here. We don't need a trial period because the buildings are there and have been for a couple of years, so it can clearly be seen what they're like. A temporary planning permission, it then goes on to say, may also be appropriate to enable the temporary use of vacant land or buildings prior to any longer-term proposals coming forward, what he calls a meanwhile use. And I think that fits within or is consistent with the advice that Andrew has given you in the sense that the temporary planning permission would enable the land to be used for this purpose prior to longer-term proposals, i.e. for a permanent building coming forward. So that fits, I think, within what you've been advised by Andrew.
I think that's very useful advice, very, very sage advice as well. Yes, I'm going to bring the Vice Chair in now.
Thank you, Chairman. Committee, there's a lot of discussion here about definitions, and one thing I would suggest is that we need to satisfy ourselves what is temporary. Are we talking about temporary permission? Are we talking about temporary accommodation or temporary buildings? I see nothing in the documentation that talks about the buildings themselves being temporary. It talks about the accommodation being temporary and was granted for a period of 6 months. Now, nobody would argue that those buildings were going to collapse within that 6 months or at the end of that 6 months. So are the buildings permanent? Is any building permanent? Is Windsor Castle permanent? I think we're looking at the principle of the accommodation, not necessarily the actual physical structures, which, if I can just, it talks about them being simple, unremarkable, functional and inoffensive. Now, those words all may suggest temporariness rather than permanence. I think that's something we need to bear in mind.
Thank you, Chair. We've got to look at the application before us, and that's to make this temporary accommodation permanent. So, like any building, it needs maintenance. It'll need maintenance. Buildings fall down over time. And if that happens here, they'll have to come back with another application to replace those buildings on those sites. They want these to be there. They want to remove the temporary. They want them to be permanent. Now, the closest thing that I can think to this application is something like a gypsy site, where you've got caravans that have a very limited lifespan, start leaking. But it's a site that's got permission, and they come back and they can replace the caravans on the site. With this, they'd have to come back with whatever building they wanted to replace on the site. But they want to make these buildings, the planning permission, permanent, not temporary. They want to remove the temporary bit. They want it to be permanent. That's what they applied for. That's what we should be considering, and not looking to put a time limit on the buildings. Because if the buildings start to drop down, they'll have to come back to us with an application to replace them.
Thank you. Do you want to come back?
Yeah, I in some ways I agree with Councillor Collins in that. In some ways I don't. A gypsy use or any caravan use is an application for that is a use of the land. So we don't approve the specific caravan. We approve the use of the land to site the caravan on it. What we're dealing with here is a building. So this is the built development. It is these buildings that you see on the screen. So it is these buildings. So if these buildings were to collapse or be blown away in a freak tornado or whatever, then there would be a need for a further planning permission to replace them. Unlike with a gypsy site, if the gypsy's caravan gets blown away by said freak tornado, then they can just buy a new caravan and put it on that land.
Point I was making, Chair, was they got a very limited lifespan like these. Yeah.
We understood your point, yeah.
On that point, a better analogy would be the old Premium Bond site and the blocks at Norcross and the original Warbreck Hill site, which were designed as evacuation hospitals from Dunkirk in 1940. Thankfully, they were never used on a great scale for that purpose, but they were designed, I believe, with a 10-year shelf life, for want of a better, and most of those survived into the 2000s, in some cases into the 2010s. So they were temporary, became permanent maybe in a similar, philosophically in a similar way to this.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Ledger.
Thank you. I had a similar question to Councillor Evans, and I actually think the point that Andrew made was sort of answered my question. I was wondering if, in terms of this committee and our powers or the council's powers, could we, I don't know if it's expired COVID legislation, but could we, rather than grant planning permission, grant an extension to the temporary, no, Andrew shakes, okay. So, well, in which case, going back to the point about granting temporary planning permission anyway, I think that's probably a good compromise, and I think the consensus is going that way, perhaps. I wouldn't suggest the 10, 15, 20 years. My suggestion would be a much shorter period, even of 5 years, because I would, as a civil servant, I can tell you if you say anything longer than 5 years, it will just be completely forgotten about and nothing will happen. But so I think where we're going would be perhaps helpful to not stand in the way of it, MOJ, because this is kind of essential and needs to be done. So temporarily approve these buildings on a temporary nature with a sort of nudge to the MOJ that they need to come back in a few years. My suggestion would be 5, no more than 5, for the fresh application for more traditional buildings or permanent solid buildings.
Andrew, I think that's very similar to what you were suggesting, wasn't it, earlier on? So do you want to just, amplify that?
I think that is sort of saying the point that I was making. A temporary planning permission is a feasible option. If committee wish to impose that or direct me to impose it when we grant the planning permission, assuming that the rest of the things are sorted, then that's perfectly fine. That will be reasonable. It will comply with policies, because there's a justification about the appearance of the buildings. There's a justification about the potential future concerns for prisoner welfare. So those are all planning matters that we could justify the condition on the basis of. The question I had previously was the timescale. Obviously, Councillor Ledger's made a pitch for a shorter timescale. It may be that the committee want to discuss that, and obviously Councillor Settle's proposed the application, so it perhaps might be something for him to give thought to.
I'm going to bring Councillor Dixon in because he's been waiting patiently, and then I'll bring you in. I know, but it may well be related to this point.
It is, Chair, and thank you. It just concerns me that we're thinking about sticking a time limit on these when if we say 10 years, they might be done and dusted in one. If we say 10 years, they might last 40 years, and we're not to know that. There's other agencies that check on the status of these. I'm sure they'll be audited every year by the prison authorities, and that's for them to do, not this committee. So I'm happy with the application as it is. I'm also happy for us to suggest that, this is done on the agreement that these buildings are audited and are ensured that they are in the right condition for us to be housing prisoners in them every year. But that's a job for the prison authorities. It's not it's not a job for this planning committee. So I'm happy with this application, Chair.
Okay.
Mark.
Mark.
Yeah, really, it was that issue, I suppose, that I was going to comment on in terms of what we, as a planning committee, should be looking at. The guidance clearly says that we shouldn't be seeking to do the job of other legislation, and there will be other legislation that seeks to ensure that the buildings are fit for standard. Whether that is correctly applied in individuals' views is largely immaterial from how we are looking at it. I think in terms of this, I mean, the building is clearly a sort of a modular system intended to be what you would normally call a temporary type of building. What is temporary? We've had that debate in the past. But I would say that if the committee is looking towards a temporary use or a temporary permission, then that permission, that condition and the reason for imposing that condition should be based upon the design of the buildings, and the fact that they appear as temporary structures. If you are applying sort of the new tests of, whether this is beautiful development, I think you'll be stretching a point to try to make that point. So I think the fact that it is a temporary type of structure, it was obviously thrown up fairly quickly under legislation which in itself was temporary legislation and was not extended. So I think that if there's a reason for the condition, it should be along that lines, rather than the quality of the accommodation within that envelope. So it's the envelope itself that we're looking at. I think going on in terms of the advice in the National Planning Practice Guidance, there is guidance about not generally granting a second temporary planning permission. So once you've granted a permission, you shouldn't be sort of extending those unless there are sort of extenuating circumstances. So I think in terms of a period for these buildings, I think you have to look at the tests of reasonableness. And I think if we were to look at a 5-year permission, I would say that those buildings are probably likely to have a shelf life longer than that. I imagine that the manufacturer of a modular unit like that would try to demonstrate that their facility had a longer than 5-year time span. So I would have thought something like a 10-year period will be a reasonable amount of time, having regard to the visual impact, albeit that it's limited, as we've heard already, but just the nature of development in the Greenbelt and the fact that the buildings were likely to be reasonable for that period of time, in a reasonable condition for that period of time. And it gives the MOJ time to design a sufficient response, get the funding in place, etc. So you're not in a situation in 5 years' time, the scheme not being ready and having to grant a further 5 years to allow the scheme to come forward. But I think a temporary permission, say of 10 years, that obviously the period is up to the committee, but at that time it would clearly send a message to the MOJ that that's the intention of the committee in granting a permission. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Miss Evans has probably just got there before me, really. the key point of information that we need, and then I think we can delegate this out to the officers, is for them to actually find out what the manufacturing shelf life is. And if that is, for example, 12 years and we've already had 3, then I would be quite happy for them to say impose a 9-year temporary order on that. I think it just comes down to information, and one vital bit of information we're lacking, and that is what the shelf life of this thing is. We know it's temporary, but our decision should be based around key facts, and once we find that out, we can move on, and I'll be quite happy to delegate along those lines. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's interesting. So that's a proposal to actually delegate authority to the officers regarding the shelf life and definition about, rather than just plucking a figure out, because actually we're then entering the area of deciding on a figure without due experience of that, and there are people better placed to be able to do that. Could you just clarify, Mark, because you said the other aspect of that presentation that you just made was regarding not so much the condition of the building, but the concern about the design of the building over a longer period of time. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, as Andrew said in his initial presentation, if we were considering this at day one, there was no building there, come forward, notwithstanding the, that COVID legislation that was there temporarily, then you will be sort of asking questions about whether this was appropriate. It's only those circumstances that have led us to the recommendation that we put before committee. But, like I say, notwithstanding that, you can also take an equally valid viewpoint that, those buildings, you could have a better development there, notwithstanding the fact that it is difficult to see these from outside the site. So part of the new move in planning guidance is about the quality of developments, the visual quality of developments, and therefore, you can sort of say, well, these are okay for now. They fill a hole, as Mr. Curtis said, in terms of like a type of a meanwhile type of use. But they, in the longer term situation, then they should be replaced by something of a more permanent and a better design quality. And I think that's, like I say, in terms of the condition, the reason for the condition, which I think is probably just as important as the condition itself here, is to respond to that fact that what we're looking for is a better designed, more long lasting, more attractive, let's face it, building or series of buildings. I suppose the fact that there are a series of them would give them an opportunity there to sort of to phase the redevelopment over time. So it's not just a case of like clearing them all out and redeveloping it. You could do one, then the next, then the next, over the 4 sort of individual buildings.
The question that I want to raise, because it's pertinent to the stage that we've reached with this particular debate, is in terms of establishing shelf life, that we would obviously have to then be mindful that that assessment will presumably be made by the Ministry of Justice, for whom they're responsible for these for this accommodation. And I'm just going to ask a question. I mean, one, is that true? Because then we're putting, and it may be appropriate to do this, but the decision regarding, the shelf life and therefore the amount of temporary permission that we are giving, whether it's 10 years, 12 years, 5 years, or whatever it is going to be in the hands of the Ministry of Justice, who are fairly content to propose what they're proposing, with no limit in terms of, and it may be that wouldn't be something that would sit comfortably with members, but at the same time, my own view on this is it may be that we have to accept that the appropriate body for establishing shelf life of a building will be the body that's responsible for the prison. That's the Ministry of Justice, and therefore we may have to accept that as a judgment in terms of that shelf life. I'm increasingly minded to sort of want to accommodate some way, Andrew, Mark and Ian, the concerns of the committee here regarding the future. So I am sort of, listening very much to the concerns that are being expressed here, and I feel as a committee we will have to decide on this, obviously, how we accommodate those concerns and how we look at it.
Sorry, Chairman, can I make a suggestion? I'll turn my microphone on. On page 49, there is a recommendation to the committee that says that the decision to grant planning permission is delegated to the head of planning. How about if we insert, sorry, the microphone's feeding back. How about if we insert in consultation with the chair and vice chair after that? And then it continues to say, is to be made following receipt and consideration of further details, and it talks about the drainage. And then at the end of that sentence, add, and that clarification has been sought over the design life expectancy of the buildings, which is the point that I think Councillor Parrington made, which will then inform a time frame for an additional condition that ensures that this planning permission is a temporary one. Yeah, so Mr. Evans is waving at me as in a way that gives me the vibe that he's disagreeing with the suggestion I've put.
Sorry, Chairman. All I was going to say is that in terms of design life, I've just Googled sort of a porter cabin. These not necessarily porter cabins, but they sort of say 30 to 60 years. So what I would say, I think going back to my original point about the fact that the design of these buildings is more of a temporary appearance, and it's going back to the design. I think if it were just to say that if a 10-year period, that should be plenty in terms of its design lifespan. But our concern is not its design lifespan, but the nature of the development and the design of it. Then that will give us 10 years, and we wouldn't then need to go into what the warranty is, etc. Because just looking at the warranty of another company's temporary structures, different parts of them have got a different. So you got the structure, then you got the cladding, and then you got the windows. So everything's got a different time on it, depending on which bit it is. And then you end up with a ship of Theseus as you start to replace bits. So I would suggest that we just say 10 years. That should be plenty. That a building of that nature, clearly they are relatively new, should be plenty within that life scope. But our concern is not necessarily the longevity of the building that's been built, but its appropriateness in terms of design. And then that would hopefully cut to the chase in the decision.
And would that then give ourselves as a planning authority, as the committee, in 10 years' time to reassess that and to look at the evidence in terms of what is appropriate there? Again, I'm just sort of a bit nervous of going into Ministry of Justice sort of authority here, but I'm asking the question.
So hopefully within the 10 years, we'll have a scheme to consider replacements for these. But if it got to it and in 10 years' time, these buildings are still there, there's not been a scheme, then we could consider renewal. And at that stage, we could sort of say that it's inappropriate to renew it for whatever reason. We'd have to have regard to the prevailing policies, etc., in place at that time. Or we could renew it for a further period. As I said, the general guidance is you shouldn't be keep issuing temporary permissions ad infinitum. So what we should be doing is sort of looking at it. Is it still appropriate? But why is it required still? If we only thought it should be there for 10 years in the first place, so we should be reanalyzing that assessment rather than necessarily sort of saying here's 10 years, here's another 10 years, here's 5 years, whatever it is. Now, it could well be that after 10 years' time, they come back to us and said, oh, we've got our plans to put a new building up, but it's taken longer, and can we have another 5 years? Then you'd have to take that into account. But it would just be on the circumstances then. It wouldn't just be an automatic, here's another renewal. If you go back many years when, garage sites and things like that, councils usually grant sort of, here's planning permission for sort of an asbestos garage, say, 5 years permission, and then you'd renew it and making sure that it was kept in a good condition. But all the guidance that allowed that to happen, that was all changed, and you're not supposed to use temporary permissions in that manner now. So I would say, like I say, just go with 10 years, and that's about the design rather than about the longevity of the building.
Right, I mean, we could, the gist of what you said is probably still there, Andrew, but the suggestion is that perhaps with a specific 10-year, that's probably advisable from the sound of that advice. I think what we're getting to here is, I'm trying to find something that we can put to the committee for you to vote on, and you can have your own views and express those as well. But to just insert a little bit of a caveat here in terms of, and a level of control that gives us, perhaps an opportunity in 10 years to revisit this, to see how we're going with this and whether it's appropriate, particularly on the aspect of design, which has been raised, which I think is important. But I'm picking up from the committee that they're certainly not, too happy with what's being proposed as it is, and that there ought to be some additional sort of caveat here, I think. But I am going to bring in Councillor Settle and then Councillor Evans.
Okay, Chairman, I think it's a very eloquent solution by Mark there. I'm happy to accept that as the proposer. Just a comment though, there must be hundreds of these applications up and down the country by various ministries, education in particular, and I think this sort of approval of ours is going to be noticed by central government, and they're going to start worrying about what's going to happen across the country. I accept that's not our concern, but I think there will be some sort of comment back that there's a precedent here. Thanks.
I think what it also reveals is, as a planning authority, that we've looked very carefully at a particular application, and that if we're articulating our concerns, we want to make sure that those concerns are enshrined in any recommendations that we make. And I think with the delegated authority that we're giving to the officers, there is a specific element now that this is time-related, a temporary permission, rather than endorsing what is here in the planning application.
Yeah, I fully accept that.
Yes, okay. And then Councillor Evans.
Yeah, Chairman, thank you. Well, just to sort of tidy up the niceties of what the recommendation is, my suggestion would be that we don't alter the recommendation at all, because that delegates the committee would be giving officers the authority to grant planning permission, subject to the drainage matters being resolved, and then a series of conditions that just specify what the planning permission is. But we would add an extra condition in to limit it specifically to 10 years. And then I'll draft that up and make sure that that's in the minutes of the meeting on that basis.
I think that's sensible.
Providing that Councillor Settle and then whoever seconds the motion are satisfied with that approach.
Councillor Evans, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I think we've all had a good discussion there, and I think it's important that just because it possibly sits outside of our remit, and or for want of another phrase, it's not our job, doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't actually see if we can improve on something. And we all have concerns about this building. And I think if you follow the thread from the very beginning, this application was a temporary application to meet a requirement during COVID. And we're trying to turn something which was temporary into something which is permanent. And I think, it's also worthy mentioning the fact that these buildings have already been here 5 years, because they were put in place in 2020. So they're approaching 5 years, 4 years time. So if we gave them another 10 years, then actually we're saying that the building in their prime condition would be 15 years old by the time they would have to look at replacing them. I was feeling positive about Mr. Curtis's route on the second option that he gave us there, because I think that gave us a clear route to improve on what was in front of us. I think any application, we've already got some existing permanent accommodation blocks on that site. So there is obviously a clear distinction between what was already there and what the temporary structures were. And providing that that condition that Andrew suggested was condition 1 rather than one at the very bottom, because I think with every government ministry, and the money is tight, and they're going to try and extend that envelope as long and as far as they possibly can. And if it's all right saying, well, they will come back and they will monitor the quality of the accommodation, but they are marking their own homework in that way. So I think it would be remiss of us as a committee not to take the opportunity that's in front of us to give them clear signal that we're happy to allow this building to stay there, but it has to be on a time limited basis. And on that basis of that condition, I'm happy to second.
Right, we've got a seconder. I just want to make sure that Councillor Settle, I'm going to ask Andrew to articulate what we're actually what you're proposing here, in terms of maybe perhaps dealing with this matter through a condition rather than changing the actual recommendation, which I think you're happy with. But I'll ask Andrew, Councillor Settle, to read through that again, and that's for the attention, obviously, of everybody within the committee as well, but also Councillor Settle can be absolutely sure what he's actually proposing.
Yes, Chairman, thank you. I'm not proposing that the recommendation itself, the words, the paragraph at the top of the recommendation on page 49 is amended in any way. So that's just giving officers the delegated power to grant planning permission subject to the drainage matter being satisfactorily resolved. But I am suggesting that an additional condition be added to the list of conditions below, with that being condition 1, picking up Councillor Evans's point. And that says something along the lines of the planning permission hereby, the buildings hereby approved shall be removed from the site, and the land reinstated to its previous condition no later than 10 years from the date of this planning permission, with the reason relating to the design aesthetics of the buildings in question. Yeah, the design aesthetics of the building in question, and that relates to policy GD7 of the local plan.
Are you happy with that, Councillor Settle?
Yeah, the condition is just as binding as the recommendation.
Yes, okay. And Councillor Evans?
Yeah, can we ask Mr. Curtis whether that is watertight?
I don't have any problems with it, Chairman, no.
Thank you. Okay, Councillor Ledger.
Thank you. No, I think it's been a really constructive discussion. I'm happy. I just wanted to ask a clarification. When you're saying 10 years from the date of planning permission, now that we were to give you authority to delegate out, is there a time, could you not delegate for another 2-3 years with everything that's going on?
Yeah, well, the only matter that we would be waiting for is for the drainage to be resolved. It's obviously unfortunate it took the Ministry of Justice best part of 12 months to provide the information, but United Utilities have responded to say that they're looking at it. So I'm hoping that I'll get their views back within the next week or so. The only query is that if they are unsatisfied, and then the Ministry of Justice take another extended period to get the comments back. But having heard the comments here, let's see that it's we'll try and keep pressure on them to make sure that it's resolved relatively quickly now.
Okay, well, I think you've heard Andrew articulate what the proposition is, and the proposer and the seconder are happy with that. So could I ask, are there any other comments before we go to the vote? Any questions? Okay.
There isn't anything to stop the applicant then at the end of that period of time submitting a new application for a permanent structure there. So we're not saying that they have to limit the number of people in the prison. We're just saying that's great. Thank you.
Okay. So all those in favour, please indicate. All those against? Any abstentions? Councillor Collins. Of course. Thank you. Thank you, members, for that. And we had a very long debate, some really good questions. So thank you for your time there. Could I just draw your attention to page 52 of the report in front of you, which is regarding 4 appeal decisions, all of which were by the inspectors dismissed. The details are there in front of you. I won't go through them. You can look at them at your leisure. but all 4 appeals were dismissed, so it upheld the decision of the planning officers. Of course you can, yeah.
Yeah, just very briefly on the appeals, there obviously is 4. The latter 2 are house extensions, where there were design issues, one of which is an enforcement matter, the Eves Road one. The top 2 relate to the garden place at Cropper Road, which is obviously, it's part of the Cropper Road allocation, the residential and mixed use allocation up there. The schemes that were provided failed because the neighbourhood centre elements, which was the first of the 2 that's listed there, was of an insignificant size to provide for the reasonable needs of the community that's becoming established up there. So that's why we were opposed to it, and the inspector effectively sort of found that we were right on that point. Therefore, he dismissed the 2 appeals. There were some other matters as well. We are working with them. We're meeting them later this week. Hopefully, now we've got this appeal decision behind us, that will bring more weight to our position in terms of arguing for a suitable scheme when they do come back to the table. Obviously, we've had applications at Whitehills this morning for employment development. We've had applications for residential development at the previous committee. We'll have applications for residential development at a future committee. So I just wanted to make members aware that we are working with developers to try and make sure that the community that comes forward there is one that has not just a load of houses and nothing else, or some big units and nothing else, but also has a suitable neighbourhood centre with some shops and open space and adequate parking for all of those. So hopefully this appeal decision will give a bit of power to our elbow, or a bit more power to our elbow in terms of arguing for that with the landowners.
Thank you for that, Andrew, and thank you to the officers and to all members for your attendance today. And welcome, Councillor Goodman, to the life of a planning committee. I hope you've enjoyed your experience, and remember, perhaps next time you might be even a little bit more involved, because you'll feel, part of the committee.
Absolutely.
All right, thank you. Thank you to officers.